That's right. You're listening to another episode of the Co-Main Event Mixed Martial Arts Podcast. I'm Chad Dundas. That's Ben Folks. We're both longtime MMA journalists, and for the last 12 years, we've been meeting here every week to break down all the action in the wild, weird, and occasionally wonderful world of mixed martial arts. Ben, whether we like it or not, last weekend is going to go down as one of the biggest of the year in combat sports, and probably one of the biggest weekends of recent memory, if not one of the biggest weekends of all time. You had Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson on Friday night, which actually turned out to be a damn cultural phenomenon, if not exactly a great fight. And then on Saturday, of course, you had UFC 309, where John Jones retained his UFC heavyweight title with a fairly easy win over the returning Stipe Miocic. We got a lot of interest around these two fights. And one of the kind of funny things about last weekend is that most of the actual interesting, important, discussable news was the stuff that happened around the fights, not necessarily the fights themselves. So we're going to be flying by the seat of our pants a little bit this week. We're going to try to work in some listener mail as we go, because we got a lot about Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson and John Jones versus Stipe Miocic. So that's what we're going to do, with some additional UFC 309 talk, I think, as time allows. First, though, if you didn't see it on social media, we need to tell you about some exciting news regarding the CME Patreon page, and that is that now through December 15th, we are running a 50% off holiday sale. That's right, folks, half off. Right now, if you are not a paying subscriber to the CME Patreon, you can get 50% off either on a monthly membership or on the big dog, the annual membership. If you go over to the site and use the code 20E37, that's 20E as an echo, 37. You got to act now before December 15th. Maybe you thought about joining the Patreon. Maybe you used to be a member and you wandered away. This would be a great time to either check it out or come back to the fold, but you got to do it today. Go over to the site and enter 20E37 and sign up.
Chad, I don't know. How can we even afford to do that? A 50% off
We can't.
special?
We can't afford it. But you know what? It's the holiday season, Ben, folks. We're out here trying to give back to the community who have supported the longest running, continuously running MMA podcast in the world, as far as we know. And as I've said again and again, as far as we know, probably the only MMA podcast in the world.
Probably.
I don't know of any other MMA podcast. So you ask, can we afford it? Hell no, we can't afford it. We're losing our pants on this deal. But we got to do it. We got to do it for the people. The people deserve it.
Well, and with that Patreon membership, they also get access to the CME Discord, where the only rule is no assholes, and
That's
where
right.
that rule actually seems to work to make it a fun, healthy, just enjoyable and productive place to talk about MMA as well as every other damn thing under the sun with a bunch of like-minded, interesting, intelligent people. And frankly, I feel like the board, the CME board, is gonna put our feet to the fire a little bit once they find out we're doing this 50% off deal. I think that there's going to be a lot of unhappy shareholders,
Yep.
but the winners in this are the people themselves.
That's right. The board is going to be coming for our heads. But you know what? We're mavericks. We're disruptors. And so here we are trying to give the people a good deal. Remember, 20E as an echo, 37. That's how you get on board. Ben.
Wait, but before we move on to UFC 309 stuff, there's an important update.
Okay.
What? Glowing trophy? Who won a glowing trophy?
What on earth is that? Is that
Chad, you know how our beloved Seattle Kraken, they once had the JV Jones hat that they would give to the player of the game.
Yeah.
Then they moved to a championship belt, which frankly felt a little bit, I don't know, bland, just like everybody else. The Stingers hockey team that I play on in the 35 and over league, we have this. You can't really see it here, but it says Stingiest Stinger on there. This
Okay.
trophy fucking glows. has a bunch of different settings.
Yeah, it's giving me
So
a migraine
rainbow
right
light. Look at
now
this.
just to
Look at
look at
that.
it. No, it's very cool.
You remember the settings because once you turn it off, you got to cycle through them all to get it back off again. Whoa! Look at that one. What? This is really a treat for the people who are listening to the audio only. Trust me, it's magnificent. I received this due to my performance in last night's game, a 4-1 victory for the Stingers that included a breakaway goal by yours truly, and just a lot of good defensive plays, a lot of just dishing the puck. I was dishing it, Chad. I was a distributor out there. I was facilitating the offense, and you know, you bring home the hardware.
Yeah.
It's a lot of responsibility though, because not only do you have to remember to bring it with you next week, you are also responsible for deciding who gets it next week. Now, a lot of people saying you can't give it to yourself. A lot of people say that. I just say, you know what? May the best Stinger receive the trophy next week. That's all. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, two things about this. I was planning to move on to Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson immediately, but I got to make two statements.
Yeah, by all means.
Number one, this is a great. Okay, number one, congratulations. We'll amend it to 3 statements. Number one, congratulations. Number two, this would be a great example of content that should be saved for behind the Patreon paywall. So
no, nobody wants that.
If the people want to know, just a hint, aside from all the MMA talk of the kind of personal color that you will get behind the Patreon paywall, that's the kind of stuff that we'll be talking about in addition.
Literal color.
To all of the John Jones, Stipe Miocic, UFC 309 stuff that we'll be continuing to break down over there this week. Also, we do have a YouTube page, right?
Yeah.
YouTube, was it youtube.com/co-main event podcast? Is that what it is?
You know what? Let's
because like you said, this content where you're showing off the glowing trophy, probably not great for the audio listeners, but it is a good opportunity for us to point out you can go watch the video of this show over at the YouTube page.
That's right. Co-main event podcast. It is, in fact, at co-main event podcast on YouTube. We could use, frankly, a few more subscribers. I'm just saying. We're
now that people know about it.
Yeah.
Maybe they will.
We have not, in fact, mentioned it at all. But yeah, you're right.
All right. You've taken us on this 7-minute jag, but here we are. Ben, Jake Paul and Mike Tyson over the weekend. You know what? Not to blow our own horns, but people started asking us about this fight months ago, which probably should have been our first clue that the normies were going to show up by the masses of normies were going to show up for this fight. And the thing that we said when people started coming up to us, people that otherwise would have nothing to do with combat sports, and they started talking to us about this fight, they started saying Mike Tyson is going to kill this kid, right? And the very thing that you and I said, we have it on tape. We have said it on these shows in the past. We said, I think we all better be ready for Jake Paul to jab his way to a lackluster unanimous decision win against Jake Paul. And Ben, folks, that is exactly what happened out there on Friday night.
Yeah, we did say it. I mean, I don't know if we really deserve credit as some kind of fight sports prognosticators on this one, because I feel like if you know what's really going on at all, this one was pretty easy to call. We were mostly stunned, I think, both of us, at how intense the interest in this fight was among those normies and how many of them seemed somehow capable of convincing themselves that Mike Tyson was not nearly 60 years old. Yeah. I was stunned over and over again how many people you'd talk to who seemed to think that it was still 1996.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just that Mike Tyson, the fighter, is frozen in time in their minds to some extent. Maybe it's that if they don't follow the fight game enough, they haven't witnessed the particular heartbreak of seeing somebody show up when they're over the hill and losing to somebody who has no right to beat them.
Yeah.
In a fair world. We've seen it.
Yes.
We've been there.
These are all valid points because, this turned out to be one of the biggest probably combat sports events of all time. 65 million homes on Netflix, 70,000 people at Cowboy Stadium. a record gate outside of Las Vegas. So many people interested in this fight and watching this. People still talking about it at my office yesterday and
Damn.
obviously wanting to talk to me about it because they know that I cover combat sports and have for a while. And as you said, a lot of people had convinced themselves that Mike Tyson was going to win because they pictured him as having been frozen in carbonite like Han Solo in Return of the Jedi, and we were just going to thaw him out and send him out there, and he was going to put Jake Paul in a pine box. What I had a lot of people saying to me yesterday, and a lot of people that I saw over the weekend on social media, was that having watched this fight, they felt sad, they
Mm-hmm.
felt mad, they felt dirty for having watched it. And I will be perfectly honest with you. I had a hard time not responding in incredibly diehard voice. Welcome to the party, pal.
Yeah.
Because we are over here experiencing this multiple times a year, more often than we would like to. But I just wanted to say this before we maybe discuss this a little further. Inside the bubble, we know that normal people only show up for the worst fights.
Yeah.
Right? This is not new. This has been something that has been going on forever. They
Or
like
when they show
spectacles.
up, that will make them the worst fights. Like the time I told my friends, you got to see this guy Anderson Silva. He's incredible. And then that happened to be the time that he was fighting Talis Laitis. And I was like,
mostly
sorry.
though, mostly though, they love the spectacles. They love the freak shows. And when it's over, invariably, all you hear about it is how terrible it was. And my response to that at this point is like, if people maybe showed up for the good fights, they wouldn't feel that way. Like, stop showing up for McGregor, Mayweather, and Tyson Paul and start showing up for some of the actual fights between the best in the world. And maybe you won't have such a negative experience.
Right. But they don't actually care about that.
And
They,
that's,
they
yeah, but
like,
like I saw Ariel say this yesterday, and he's like, basically, you conned yourself by showing up for this fight. If you are interested, if you want to see people fight, watch the guys and girls that are good at it. Don't show up to watch 58-year-old Mike Tyson, who, not to paraphrase Chris Rock, who says you're not old, but you're too old to be in the club. He's not necessarily that old, but he's too old to be fighting Jake Paul.
right. And I think, though, I was a little bit surprised at how many people I saw, especially people who I know are not fight fans, don't care about fighting at all, never watch fights, who I saw on social media or heard from one way or another, who was like, "This was bullshit. I can't like I feel awful for having watched that. I can't believe they did this to me," or they're acting like they were somehow like uh, they were tricked or bamboozled or something. And part of me was like, how did you not know that this was probably what you were going to get? But also, how do you not realize what you actually did get from this? Because yeah, like you mean you showed up to watch a YouTuber who has taken up boxing and he fought a damn near senior citizen version of a fighter you heard of over 20 years ago was the last time Mike Tyson was relevant. And then you come away from that being like, I don't know, man, that shit was not Hagler Hearns. That wasn't the Rumble in the Jungle. What the hell was that? First of all, you didn't pay for it, really. You didn't pay like pay-per-view prices. It was on Netflix. You probably already had Netflix. What you did was you stayed home and you gave over a couple hours of your life to it on a Friday night in November. And maybe it's my fight fan brain. I kind of go into this calculation of like, well, you didn't give up much. So, in order for you to have been robbed, uh, you would have had to sacrifice more. If you had paid $80 for this and got that, sure, go ahead and complain about it. But this shit was on Netflix. That was part of how they got you here. Was they put it on Netflix from Cowboy Stadium. They made it seem like a big, huge deal that you just already had access to. And so a bunch of people stayed home and they watched it. What you actually got out of it was you got to be part of like a national conversation. You got to be a part of this cultural moment. This is the first time in a long, long time when it felt like you look on social media, you look around, listen to people talking. I was listening to people talking in bars about this all week. So maybe it says something about my life, but I was hearing them talk about it. I wasn't bringing it up. fact, Chad, I was hearing people talk about it, and I was telling myself, stay out of it. Don't get involved in this conversation. And although one dude, I did tell, he and his friend were arguing about it and trying to place bets on it and everything. And I told him as I was pushing away from the bar, Chad, finishing up my one cocktail before heading home. And I was like, Jake Paul via decision. That's your bet. And people think that I'm just acting like I know what happened after the fact. If you take our 50% offer, join the Patreon, you'll get access to the Friday Power Hour, in which we do our $20 we never want to see again betting segment, Chad. I had Jake Paul to win this fight. $5 made me like $7.17. And I had Jake Paul via decision on that one, Chad. $5 made me 21. It's not even to say how well I did on the Johnny Bones fight. So I cashed out pretty handsomely. And don't worry, I'm going to crow about that all week long. But this was the first time I could remember where you're watching fight sports and it feels like everyone is watching the same thing on the same night and talking about it with each other. Now, a lot of those people, you're right, did not know what they were going to see, did not know what they were actually looking at, didn't have the ability, like, through a knowledge of this sport to understand it. But it just doesn't happen that often that there's any kind of fight sport that everybody is watching all at the same time and you're all getting to participate in a conversation about it. That's super rare. That's like some Super Bowl shit that we never get in fight sports. It's a little bit of a shame that it took this to give it to you. But I also, I was watching this fight and going like, yeah, this is kind of what I expected to see. Is Jake Paul easily outpointing a feeble and somewhat elderly Mike Tyson, but also not really wanting to hurt him.
Right.
And I saw so many people afterwards be like, this shit was fixed, man. This is a fixed fight. And I was like, yeah, in the sense that it was two buddies fighting to make a bunch of money, and the guy who could hurt the other guy didn't want to because he knows you're going to be an asshole if you put Mike Tyson at the age of 58 into the hospital with a brain bleed or something. Then it's not fun anymore for you to be doing your YouTuber influencer act in boxing. This was always what it was going to be, and they just didn't know enough about it to know to expect that.
Right. If it was rigged in any way, it was rigged to make it easier on Mike Tyson, which is I think a point that a lot of those people are missing. If they tuned in to see Hagler Hearns, what they saw was Jake Paul out here essentially committing elder abuse, right? I sort of downplayed it the week of the fight, saying that I didn't think that it had reached McGregor Mayweather levels of hype, but it absolutely blew up over the weekend on Friday. Eclipsed anything I think I've ever seen before in terms of a combat sports event. The weird part was, in addition to people showing up and putting the posts on Facebook, because that's where normal people hang out, about their excitement for this fight, a lot of people were rooting for Mike Tyson, the vast majority of people. And these are people that I would never in a million years suspect would root for Mike Tyson in a fight, because Mike Tyson, as everybody knows, is not a nice guy. Mike Tyson would probably tell you that he is a bad guy if you asked him. As everybody knows, convicted rapist, right? Most famous for being the heavyweight champion who beat people up more viciously than any other heavyweight champion we've ever seen before. Most famous for biting Evander Holyfield's ear in a fight in the late 90s. Most famous for saying he wanted to eat Lennox Lewis's children. And yet you've got all of these like progressive, definitely, liberal-minded people out here rooting for Mike Tyson. And obviously that's based on nostalgia.
Yes.
And the idea that they have this warm, fuzzy feeling about watching pay-per-views in the 90s with their dad or with their family or whatever. But it just struck me as weird, like all these people turning out to root for Mike Tyson and like gleefully hope that he beats the shit out of Jake Paul. Now, Jake Paul, of course, there's evidence to suggest he is also not a good person. But at the same time,
welcome to the fight sports party.
Right. Again, that's not why they were rooting against him, right? Like they were rooting against him out of the love for Mike Tyson and the vague notion that Jake Paul is annoying, which I thought it made for weird bedfellows over the weekend.
Yeah, I do think that with Tyson, American culture, especially if you were alive and remember him back in his prime in the late 80s and 90s, we have a weird relationship to Mike Tyson. And Some of it is definitely impacted by nostalgia, but also by just like how long it feels like we've known Mike Tyson as a culture, how many things we've watched him go through. You know, Chad, I quote Noah Cross from Chinatown: politicians, ugly buildings, and whores all get respectable if they last long enough. And that's kind of, I think, where Mike Tyson is at. I also think that there is a sense that as we have learned more about Tyson's life, what he came from, who he became, there is at least a little bit of a sense, whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not, that Mike Tyson is America's child. And we created him. The environment that we created had a Mike Tyson come out of it. Then he never really had a chance to be a normal person from like his childhood to going from reform school to like a sort of boxing gladiator academy as a youth to then being propelled to a early superstardom and riches and having people constantly trying to steal from him. This guy just never had a chance to be a normal person ever in his life. And to an extent that Mike Tyson, we watched him get broken in a bunch of different ways in the public eye. And it was sort of American culture that helped break him in a lot of ways. And so the fact that he is around now as this almost like kindly grandfather type figure, and people can feel like, oh, there he is. Like we recognize him, we know him, and we just feel like we've known him long enough that we have an affection for him, despite his many, many, many missteps.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a big part of it. I also think there's some people where they kind of know Mike Tyson for being a famous tough guy at this point. Like they don't, a lot of these people who they know who Mike Tyson is and had an opinion about Mike Tyson never watched a single Mike Tyson fight before. They maybe saw the highlights. They saw him knocking people's heads off or something. Well, they never watched any of those fights. They never really followed the guy's career. He was in The Hangover. You know,
Yeah.
he's sort of around. I remember I've told this story before, but when I taught a class on American sports culture to a group of Chinese exchange students, and I showed them a bunch of pictures of American sports celebrities just to be like, who do they actually know? And they knew almost nobody, but they knew Mike Tyson because of The Hangover. Mike Freeman from USA Today put together a top 10, and he admitted it was not exactly top 10, but 10 like most memorable moments in Tyson's life. Biting Evander Holyfield's ear is on there. The Hangover is on there. Going to prison for sexual assault at sort of the height of his fame and power as a heavyweight boxing champion was not on there at
Wow.
all. Wasn't
Wow.
mentioned. Like that sort of sums up like where we are with Mike Tyson, and just over time, you've seen the same thing happen. I'm sure, like in your personal life, there's people I know, uh, personally or professionally, where you just, you may have hated them for years or just had a negative opinion on them for years, and you see them around now, and you're kind of like, oh, okay, well at least I know him. I've known him for a long time. I feel like I know who he is for good and bad. I think that there's a lot of that going on with Mike Tyson, but it's also that's what they used to sell this thing. Was
Yeah.
Mike Tyson, you remember him as being vicious. Wouldn't it be just some bullshit if this sneering kid was allowed to go out there and beat Mike Tyson? That can't happen, can it? Or can it? Watch on Netflix. And it worked. It just flat out fucking worked. You can't argue with that. You've never seen the kind of interest that this thing had. You just look around, everybody's watching it. They knew exactly what they were doing, and I do wish people had a little bit better sense of perspective so that they didn't feel hoodwinked by you getting exactly what you were promised.
Yeah. He has had one of the most remarkable image rehabilitations in all of sports, with things like appearing on The Hangover, basically being like a regular at the UFC, a regular on this sort of manosphere podcast circle. This man had a damn one-man show.
Yeah.
Ben Folks, let's not forget about that. So it is very strange that Mike Tyson has gone on to become something of a beloved figure in the American sporting culture. Another thing that I saw people being mad about that I couldn't really believe, people were mad that Mike Tyson and Jake Paul made a lot of money from this fight. They were like, that was a terrible fight. It was a cash grab. These guys only did it for the money. I can't believe they made that much money. I was like,
those things are true. Yeah.
No shit. Welcome to prize fighting. That's why they do it. They go out there and fight for the money. And in fact, if anything, the fact that Mike Tyson made a reported $20 million and Jake Paul reportedly made much more than that, that's like one of the only redeeming things here. right? Is that these two guys that actually did the work and did the promotion and showed up and had the fight, they got a lot of the money, which is different than what we see over on our side of the street in MMA for sure. And so I would sit here and tell you that's one of the positives about this. We made Iron Mike some money. And that's good. He didn't get hurt, made a lot of money. Jake Paul rockets himself to even higher levels of fame, also made a lot of money. I don't know what there is to hate on about that just because you showed up and the fight wasn't what you thought it was going to be.
Yeah, the whole thing was to make a lot of money, and they did, frankly, a good job of the parts of it that make you a lot of money. We've seen tons of people go out there, have an absolute bloodbath of a fight, an amazing fight, the kind of fight that'll take years off your career and probably life, the kind of fight that will do lasting damage to you, but you sacrifice that, you put it all out there in order to produce an incredible fight to remind us what we love about this sport, and didn't make jack shit from it. We've seen that over and over again. So if some guys are going to go out there, they do the parts, the salesmanship and the lightning in a bottle part of it that gets them paid. I can't get mad at them for getting paid. I also, though, we got to spend a little bit of time talking about Netflix's role in all this.
Yeah.
Because
dipping its toe
quite successfully into live sports, but also at times you listen to people's experience with it, seeming like maybe we're not quite ready to do live sports. There are a whole lot of people, I don't know how your viewing experience was. Mine was not bad.
Mine was fine, actually. There was some pixelation, but other than that, it was totally fine.
My stream froze a couple times, but then it came back. Thankfully, it didn't freeze during any sort of fighting action, but it did freeze like during walkouts and stuff for Tyson and Paul. The picture quality at times did get sort of like you're staying up watching pirated Cinemax at 2 a.m. with the volume low so your parents don't hear you kind of quality. But then it would come back, It did, though, like a lot of people I saw talking about, like their streams just flat out didn't work or barely worked, or it was just like that frustrating stop and start kind of thing, which I think is going to make a lot of people wonder, like, okay, can Netflix handle the NFL? Could it do some of these big time sports broadcasts? Because you can't really make the argument like, yeah, hey, we're ready to do live sports, and then turn around and be like, but hey, there was large traffic on this thing, so like, yeah, it fucked with the quality. Like, you could make that argument in 2009 about like live streaming. In 2024, you want to show an NFL game, your shit needs to work all the time. It needs to be the entire product the entire time. The other question, though, I got to ask about Netflix, Jeff. This is a very serious question, and I want you to take your time and consider it before you answer.
Okay.
They show Mike Tyson's whole ass on purpose.
Oh, on purpose. We know they showed the whole ass.
I saw the whole ass. I'm not asking about the ass. I saw the whole ass.
Yeah. This is like the old joke where you're watching the news and then the newscaster gets up and walks away and they're not wearing pants. They've just been wearing a suit and a tie sitting at the desk the whole time. The thing that struck me is Mike Tyson standing there doing this whole interview with his ass hanging out. It's kind of like being in the locker room of like a football game or a basketball game trying to do post-game interviews and the players are standing there wearing their towels or whatever. They knew the ass was hanging out.
They had to.
Right? They knew the ass was there. And then it would have been easy to not pan over to follow Mike Tyson walking away with his ass hanging out. It would have been easy to just, smash cut back to Mauro Ranallo or someone sitting at the desk, dissolve, fade out, fade to black. You don't have to see Mike Tyson's ass. Did they do it on purpose? It would be hard to know what the motive of such a thing would be, right?
Gets people talking.
That's because they already had everybody talking. That was the thing. People were talking about this fight is rigged. And I was like, why? Why would you rig this fight? Everybody made fucking millions and millions and millions of dollars and every single person watched it. Like, you didn't have to rig it. You didn't have to show Mike Tyson's whole ass. You already crashed the site with so many people. Oh, I don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe they showed it on purpose, but I don't know why they would.
The Twitter account for Netflix tweeted out the video just in case you missed it. And so that's when I started to think, like, okay, either they screwed it up and they're leaning into it, or they did it on purpose just to make sure we're getting people talking. Because if you're on social media, it's pre-fight, you see a video where they're like, oh, Mike Tyson's bare ass was visible for several seconds on screen. Maybe that's when you're reminded that this shit is happening today. and B, going, well, hey, if they'll show the man's whole ass on TV, we're really doing some after dark stuff on Netflix. And who else, who knows what else I might see. So, like, let me go over there and check what's happening now. I mean, the, uh, a moment that kind of reminded me, here's where we are in media culture, everything, is when I saw a headline, I believe on MMA Fighting, about Mike Tyson's ass shown on Netflix. Conor McGregor reacts, and I went, "Wow, we're just like melding everything together that we do in the media space for this sport." By the way, if you were curious what his reaction was, it was positive.
Hmm.
He said it was a strong ass. Uh, Noted that Mike is God's own creature now that you've seen his ass, apparently. So that's interesting. Um, yeah, it just, to me, watching this fight and coming away afterwards being like, okay, Jake Paul really seemed to work hard to carry Mike Tyson through to the finish line on
Yeah.
this fight. There was a moment where he had Mike Tyson hurt early on, I don't know, maybe second or third round, clearly stunned him a little bit. And Rosie Perez, as a member of the commentating team, it made me wonder, like, oh, is Rosie not in on it? Did nobody tell Rosie? Because she's like, wow, what's Jake doing? He's not going after him. Why is Jake's kind of letting him off the hook here? And I was going like, yeah, of course he is. He knows that he is doing that. He is doing that on purpose to help Mike Tyson get through this thing and to not hurt him. And it kind of reminded me, like, okay, a lot of people are going to watch this and just be like, Jake Paul sucks. Couldn't even put away Mike Tyson, who Roy Jones Jr. was telling you from the second round on, doesn't look good. His legs aren't there. He looks pretty bad, and it kind of just seemed to make Roy Jones sad.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are coming away from this being like, Jake Paul actually sucks. Look at how much he didn't do. Look at how he ended up spending so much of this fight, especially in the later rounds, just kind of standing there staring at Mike and not doing anything.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the normies that tuned in for this also didn't have the context that we have inside the bubble of knowing that this has been Jake Paul's scam for years at this point now, right? Beating up beloved fighters of the past who have overstayed their welcome and aren't dangerous enough anymore to be a threat to Jake Paul. And in this case, Mike Tyson was kind of like the final boss of that strategy for Jake Paul, right? Like,
Yes.
this is the apex evolution of that particular niche in boxing, because it doesn't get any bigger than beating up an old ass version of Mike Tyson. I don't know where the gimmick can go from there, except that, okay, maybe everybody thinks Jake Paul sucks, but he called out Conor McGregor after this thing was over. There's some semblance of an idea that he might fight Jorge Masvidal in a boxing match.
Mm.
Some actual boxers are out here saying they want a piece, because of course they do. This is like Kimbo Slice showing up on The Ultimate Fighter season 10 and everybody immediately realizing this is the most famous guy here and he kind of sucks, and everybody being like, I want to fight that guy. All the famous boxers are doing that now to Jake Paul. So the question is, what can you do next if you're Jake Paul? If you put a fight again on Netflix that is you versus Jorge Masvidal, does that do any numbers? If you somehow get the UFC to allow you to box Conor McGregor on Netflix, does that do numbers? If you throw yourself to the lions and fight one of these actual boxers, does that do numbers on Netflix? It's very interesting at this point to contemplate, what do you do next if you are Jake Paul?
If you could do a Conor McGregor fight, if that is actually feasible, then you do that for sure. Because you make a ton of money on that. You still get people interested in that. The other thing to consider, though, especially the question of, does he fight an actual boxer like Ryan Garcia, of course, is like, hey, I would like to go out there and exchange just like insane ramblings with Jake Paul at a series of press conferences en route to selling a fight between us. And especially if you could fight an actual boxer who's smaller, who's considerably smaller than you, then people would be like, okay, I get that Jake Paul's bigger, but the skill difference here is going to be too much to overcome. So I'll watch this thing. You got to sell them on either the sheer celebrity star power involved, which Conor McGregor gives you that. Jorge Masvidal definitely does not give you that. Most other people don't give you that. Or you got to sell them on the promise that Jake Paul is finally going to get what's coming to him.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of us would sit here and look at it and be like, he's never going to risk that. He's not going to take on a for real boxer because he will get his ass absolutely whipped. And then where do you go? But I do think you have to remember Jake Paul thinks he's good. And he's not bad for like a person who learned to box and then, has been boxing. Like every single one of his fights has been sort of in the public eye and everything. Like he's not as bad as people want to believe he is. Like he's okay. But he is not certainly at that level of a real pro boxer, like a high level pro boxer. And yet he might talk himself into thinking that he is ready for those fights. And he might get himself in over his head. But that's sort of the sales pitch at this point, is like, you made a lot of people mad at you with this Mike Tyson fight, a lot of these normies. If you could fight somebody who they understand and they believe probably almost certainly is going to give you a hellacious ass kicking, then they might come back for round 2 of that.
Yeah. If it's going to be Conor McGregor, it better be the version of Conor McGregor who is Knox in Roadhouse, right? Does everybody know what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, you're saying we don't want like a USADA Conor McGregor rolling up in here.
Yeah, we definitely want to have this fight in Texas or Saudi Arabia where
Or
Conor
Dublin.
McGregor can
We
show.
want the Conor McGregor who physically cannot put his arms down at his sides.
Yes,
He
that is
has
exactly
to
right.
walk like that.
Yeah, that's what we need. Okay, we're gonna do, like I said, listener mail is gonna be a little bit haphazard this week because we got mail about these topics. I do want to throw this one in there from our guy Darkwing Duck, and then we'll move on, I think, to talking about John Jones and Stipe Miocic. Darkwing Duck wrote in to say, is there anything to be said for the idea that Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson was just a Trojan horse that got people to watch Amanda Serrano versus Katie Taylor?
Trojan horse is overstating it, because that would suggest the whole point was that, and not the whole point was to make a bunch of money for Jake Paul and Mike Tyson, which is what it actually was. However, I will say, one thing you do have to give Jake Paul some credit for is that when he has an opportunity like this, he brings some friends along and make sure they get paid. And I think that Jake Paul actually does care about boxing to some extent. And so he didn't have to put this fight on there. They could have had just nothing. They could have had just a bunch of undercard nobodies and nobody would have cared. He chose to put this fight on there and to put like actual like good fighters and female fighters, and a fight that he had reason to believe is going to be a really good and memorable fight and we're going to pay them well. Like they put that on there, and I think that's something. Like I think that was definitely part of the intent here. It just wasn't the whole project.
Yeah, and hey, to the credit of many of the people who tracked me down at work this week to ask me about this fight, several of them were like, that women's fight, though, that was great. Several of them said that. And so if you can get to a situation where anybody is going to remember who Serrano and or Taylor are, maybe they come back to watch again. I don't know. In which case, perhaps Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson served some manner of positive purpose in the landscape of boxing, or perhaps just inside Jake Paul's promotional company. I don't know. But
And
good
how
for
many of
people
those
for
people who
watching
came up
that.
and talked to you had ever watched a single women's boxing match or maybe women's fight at all?
Probably none. And I heard it kicked around that this was the most watched women's sporting event in American history, which, again, don't know how we fact check that, but that's what people were saying. But yeah, if people remember Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor and continue to follow their careers even a little bit, that's probably a positive.
Yeah.
All right. UFC 309 main event. John Jones, Stipe Miocic. Another fight that I think went pretty much exactly like people thought it was going to go in the end.
Who's people in that situation? The guy who had John Jones in round 3.
Yeah, that was a good pickup for you.
What?
That was a good pickup for you. John Jones goes out there in this fight I will say this. John Jones answered some of my questions about how he'd look in a longer fight at heavyweight, because I had said leading up to this fight, we only have like 2 minutes of tape on John Jones at heavyweight because that's how easily he beat Cyril Gahn to claim the UFC heavyweight title. So it was good, I thought, to see John Jones go out there with a little bit of added weight on the frame and put in, 2.5, 3 rounds of work without totally fading and, still looking somewhat dangerous. And I say that he answered some of my questions, and I guess I will amend that statement by saying sort of.
Yeah.
Because he handled Stipe, but Stipe obviously coming in at 42 years old, hadn't fought in a number of years, didn't seem to be the dangerous, fleet-footed, fast Stipe of old. And I will say this also, he seemed a little half-hearted about the whole thing, frankly. He was out there, I think, trying his best, but there were situations where, he would come forward and he'd throw combos and he was actually having some success. And then he just didn't follow up. He frankly didn't seem that interested. He didn't seem interested, or he didn't seem physically capable. So while I'm willing to say, yeah, John Jones looked good in a fight against Stipe, looked fast compared to Stipe, I don't know, man. I'm going to stop short of heaping the kind of praise on John Jones that I've seen kind of heaped on him in the wake of this fight on social media and in the media. Like, he looked good to me, but I didn't think he looked 2024 UFC heavyweight champion great. Am I crazy?
No, you're not crazy. First of all, on the Stipe front, I will say I wouldn't say it was half-hearted at all. I think that sometimes it's easy to read Stipe that way because he always looks so nonplussed about anything that's going on.
That's a fair point.
I think that he absolutely trained hard for this fight. I think he trained hard. He said he'd been training for John Jones for 2.5 years. I think that he really took this seriously and wanted to win. But also, the guy goes out there, loses this fight, and then immediately is like, oh no, I'm done. I'm not fighting. And you got the sense like, okay, so you kind of had one foot out the door anyway. There are times in watching this sport, and I feel like we'll talk a little bit more about it from the political element later on in the show, but where you're hearing one thing from the commentary team and you're seeing something else on the screen, and it's just such like a conflict in your mind. Like, if you know at all what you're watching, and then you're hearing them say a different thing and trying to shape perception in a certain obvious way, it's jarring at times. And listening to the commentary team when Stipe showed up in the cage, and they were just like marveling at his physique and mass. Daniel Cormier said, I fought Stipe Miocic. I never fought this version of Stipe Miocic, though. Look at all the muscle and the mass that he has put on. And I was like, what are you guys talking about? He looks the same. He looks more or less the same as he has always looked. He weighed in like 8 pounds heavier? And for a guy who's not cutting weight at all, that could be like a normal fluctuation. Or it could be that, the average American male puts on a couple pounds every year. It's been over 3 years since the last time we saw him. He shows up, he's 8 pounds heavier. That's not a huge difference, man. It was not like a radically different physique for Stipe, or that he looked so much stronger or more powerful or bigger. He looked the same. Physically, with his shirt off, he looked the same. And they're trying to act like, you can see what they're doing. They're trying to hype up Stipe because they believe that will make John Jones's victory seem more impressive. And then when you see him get in there and you see him both moving around and fighting, you're going like, okay, this is not the same Stipe.
Yeah.
It's not, which should not be surprising, honestly. That's not like a criticism of Stipe. The last time we saw him, he was a fighter in his late 30s who was fighting like once a year and was pretty active. Then we didn't see him for over 3 years. He came back. He's a fighter in his early 40s who has not fought in several years. Of course, you're not going to look the same. It would be amazing if you did look the same. And so, like, I'm not necessarily surprised by that, but I was surprised at how people were making it out to seem like John Jones had slayed a dragon instead of beating a diminished and aging version of the guy that Stipe once was.
Yeah. That spinning back kick was nasty, though.
It was.
As much as I can sit here and tell you John Jones looks like maybe he has lost a step, spinning back kick was nasty.
He had several great moments in the fight. The trip takedown, it was
Yeah.
almost the same one he did to Matt Hamill that separated his shoulder before Jones and did the illegal elbows that gave him his only career loss. He almost put him away with elbows in that first round. A lot of people who are not as tough as Stipe probably do get put away with. He took a ton of elbows,
Yeah.
hard, and we know how good John Jones is at that. And there are moments where John Jones is flicking out that jab, that lead hand that's just really quick and tagging Stipe, and you're like, okay, John Jones has moments of doing John Jones stuff in this fight. But it was still hard for me to come away from that and be like, that was the two baddest heavyweights on the planet, and the guy who won is therefore unquestionably the top heavyweight. I felt like, you know what? You beat the best heavyweight the UFC had to give you that night. The other guys who might potentially challenge for that title were sitting out there and watching.
Yeah. Here's a couple of questions that I wanted to get in here from listeners that I think segues us into some of this Tom Aspinall talk. We got this one from Balls Deep, who writes, "It makes me so mad when they announced John Jones as, quote, reigning, defending, undisputed champion. No, he is not. These words all have meaning. You don't just say them all because he is the champion. He literally is disputed because there is another interim champion. Does anyone else get annoyed by this, or just me? LYBE, love you both equally." And I want to read this one from Mike Garcia from voiceofgarcia.com also. But I will say, I noticed at the weigh-ins, Joe Rogan did not call John Jones undisputed. But then you get in the cage on fight night, and obviously Bruce Buffer does call him undisputed. So it's certainly I guess it might be a judgment call over there in the UFC. But Mike Garcia writes, "So, gentlemen, let's rewind the clock a bit. Dana White would not write enough zeros on the check for John Jones to fight Francis Ngannou. Therefore, he let that fight and Ngannou slip away. Will he write the zeros this time for Jones to face Tom Aspinall? Will they actually get a deal done since the ball is now in Dana's court?" And this, Ben, as I said, the number one topic coming out of this fight, not necessarily the Jones-Stipe fight itself, but now what John Jones is going to do. Dana White has said, we're not doing Alex Pereira at this point. So the question now stands, do we get John Jones and Tom Aspinall or not?
You know, I had said before that I thought that John Jones's stance on Tom Aspinall and his threat to retire after this fight was a negotiating ploy, or at least partly a negotiating ploy. And his comments afterwards made it seem like that, right? Because he was in the cage being like, I don't know, I decided I'm not gonna retire. Yay! And then was like, okay, as for like what's next, we'll see. We'll see how bad the UFC wants it. We'll talk to them, see if they can convince me to do it. And if you're John Jones, I think that makes sense, honestly, is instead of just being like, sure, I'll do whatever you guys want at my current rate. If you see there's a lot of fan demand, and if you feel like personally, I could live with myself if I never fight Tom Aspinall. I've made enough money. I've had enough of a career, and certainly John Jones could retire today, and he goes down as one of, if not the greatest MMA fighters of all time. So he doesn't really need it in any sense. If you're gonna do it, like if you guys feel like you need it for one reason or another, then you're gonna have to pay extra for it. That just makes good sense. We always say in prize fighting, do the fight that is going to get you the most money now, the most money for the next fight. So I think it's a reasonable position on John Jones's part. The question of will the UFC pony up extra dough to make it, because of what happened with that Francis Ngannou thing, it's hard for me to automatically go, yes, they will.
Yeah.
Especially if John Jones is out here saying, like, hey, look, I'll do the Tom Aspinall fight for my current rate plus one half, or I'll do the Alex Pereira fight, which you have said you don't want to make, but I'll do that at my current rate. And for the UFC, they'd sit here and be like, we're going to make a ton of money off of either one of those fights. Do we make so much more off of John Jones versus Tom Aspinall that it's worth it to us to not only write that check to John Jones, but set the precedent that you can hold us up for more money if you're willing to sit out and wait and make us pay extra for the fight everybody wants to see? I don't know about that part. I think that probably what they'll do is try to wait John Jones out for a little while. And I give it 6 months before Dana White goes from being like, John Jones is the greatest. How dare any of you goofs ever put John Jones anywhere but at the very top of the pound for pound list. He's the greatest who's ever done it. To being like, John Jones is scared to fight Tom Aspinall. John Jones doesn't want to take the risk. He sees what Aspinall can do. Maybe he should leave. Maybe he should give up his title if that's how he's thinking. I don't think it takes longer than 6 months for Dana White
Yeah.
to start doing that.
I mean, to John Jones's credit, all of this talk that he did about Tom Aspinall and his refusal to fight Tom Aspinall made the Tom Aspinall fight much bigger than it
Yeah.
otherwise would have been. Even now, the prospect of a Tom Aspinall fight seems more interesting, I think, to John Jones fans. People who tune in to watch a John Jones fight but might not tune into other UFC pay-per-views probably makes the prospect of a Tom Aspinall fight more enticing. And the one thing we know for sure, John Jones not afraid to fight Tom Aspinall. You know, John Jones been out here fighting everybody for years and years and years. I do think that there's a little bit of a calculated disdain on John Jones's part, that he feels like maybe he has earned the right to pick his opponent, which in a vacuum is probably true. You know, you have 37-year-old John Jones, one of the greatest of all time, a guy who has put in a lifetime of work for the UFC and been better than anyone. You could probably make the case that he does deserve to pick his shots. And we got a long listener mail from Jacob Ferrara that I can't read because it's too long, but basically he makes the point that he feels like many people in the media are piling on John Jones just because they don't like John Jones in and around this Tom Aspinall thing. And you can never discount that, because I think people will take the opportunity to pile on John Jones because, he has accrued a lot of negative weight around him throughout his career. But at the same time, I also think the thing that made this awkward was not necessarily just John Jones saying he didn't want to fight Tom Aspinall, but it refers back to Balls Deep's point, right? The thing that made this awkward was that John Jones is the reigning UFC heavyweight champion. And he's out here talking about how he doesn't want to fight the interim heavyweight champion, that he would rather take super fights, that he doesn't want to fight these, quote, dangerous young up and comers, that he wants to fight, quote, dangerous established champions. Like, this is the man with the belt. Like, if you're going to be talking that way, then, do what you said you would do and relinquish the heavyweight championship. But there is something admittedly awkward about having the UFC heavyweight champion saying that he won't fight the interim champion and saying he doesn't want to fight these guys who are all way bigger than him, which is one of the things John Jones said. Like, dude, you have the heavyweight gold. That's kind of the whole point.
Well, there's also an irony in that some of the stuff John Jones is saying about, I don't want to take the risk of fighting young up and comers anymore, is very similar to what Dana White accused Francis Ngannou of doing when he was sitting out his contract and waiting so he could use the UFC. Remember, that was the thing Dana White used, was he doesn't want to take the risk. Some guys are scared of the risk in this sport. He wants to take as few risks as possible and get the most money he can without taking any risk. God love him and God bless. And John Jones out here being like, I don't want to take that risk. I want to fight other fights that where like what I feel I get in either money or esteem or a name to add to the resume is makes the risk more worth it. And again, it's hard to know how much of that is negotiating and how much of that is sincere position, because John Jones, nobody seems to think as much about their own legacy in the sport as John Jones. He talks about it a lot. It was constant headed into this fight, was legacy, how you're going to be remembered. But also, as we've noted, how you're going to be remembered is not entirely up to you to decide. Other people are going to play a role in how they decide to remember you. And if the way you go out is the UFC being like, we call John Jones once a week to offer him Tom Aspinall, and he says he'd rather stay home, even if it means giving up the heavyweight title. If that starts to become the story, you know how we used to say MMA judges always remember most what they see last? This is why a takedown in the final 30 seconds can win you a close round, even if you don't do anything with it. I think that some of that could be true for John Jones's career as well. If you go out on the note of especially if the UFC changes its tune a little bit and starts to say, hey, we want this fight. We want to give you guys this fight. John Jones is the one standing in the way of making this fight happen. And then he goes out that way. He never fights again. People will remember that.
Yeah. I feel like we grew tired at some point on this podcast about talking about the UFC's current political bent.
Ugh,
But coming out of UFC 309, you can't ignore it because they
no.
won't let you ignore it at this point. It seems like every time you tune in, it gets more and more and more pervasive on the broadcast, right? Like we started out just having Donald Trump there as a spectator. Then we started having Donald Trump come out with his own Kid Rock infused walkout with Dana White walking in front of him and smirking like classy Freddie Blassie in 1980s WWF. And now we've progressed to this point at UFC 309 where like several of Donald Trump's most controversial cabinet picks are there with him at the UFC. Trump is there. Elon Musk is there. Kid Rock, who is not yet in the cabinet but was sitting there, is there. RFK Jr. is there. Tulsi Gabbard is there. Trump's two sons are there. And it's like, not only do you have like the entire Trump cabinet essentially sitting at ringside or on the front row, you won't stop talking about it during the fights, which is my main objection at this point, is that for a group of people that made a big deal about Taylor Swift being on camera 3 times during an NFL game, right? We are now absolutely cool with nothing but Trump talk. One, as if you are contractually obligated to make a Trump reference during every fight. And then every fighter, essentially, except Charles Oliveira, getting up there and essentially groveling to Trump after every fight. It's like you can't ignore it at this point. It's pervasive. And as I tweeted on Saturday night, it's honestly getting hard to watch.
Yeah, this is the most obnoxious it's been yet. This was the one where it just, you feel like they can't take it to any higher level than what it's already at. And then you saw this one, you're like, nope, turns out they can. Mentioning him during every single fight, and had like a dedicated dear leader camera to check in on what Donald Trump is thinking as he's sitting there covered in bronzer watching these fights. Mentioning at times during the fights where they're like, well, maybe the nerves are getting to these fighters. They are fighting in front of Donald Trump. And you're just like, what are you talking about? Is someone in your ear telling you, like as a producer, being like, make sure we mention Trump a couple times during this fight? It's so incredibly overwhelming. And it is the irony, not only that, from the same people who are like, Taylor Swift is ruining the NFL because I got to see her 3 times, like just a distant shot of her in one of the luxury boxes, but the way that the UFC went from during COVID being like, hey, we don't even want to mention that COVID is happening. We don't want to mention anything that's from the outside world. Dana White would even say, this is sort of a refuge where you don't have to think about politics. You don't have to think about what's going on in the rest of the world. You are here to just enjoy some sports. You are here to be entertained and to not think about the rest of the world. And then a complete 180 shift to like, no, we are here to sort of like have some fights in front of the emperor and keep cutting away to shots of the emperor and his various flunkies. And at times it's like, how are you, like, clearly UFC does not care about what any fans who are not down with this think.
Right.
And that calculation makes sense to a certain point if you're Dana White, right? Because for Dana White, you've got a friend in the White House now. You need a visa for somebody. You need somebody to shut down a labor complaint or something. You got a friend, and you got a friend who will do favors. Like, it's impossible to even imagine Donald Trump picking up the phone from Dana White and being like, no, that would be improper for me to do that. I cannot help you there. Like, there's no way. It makes sense for you as the UFC to be like, we helped this guy get elected. We did our part. We're going to help feed his ego now, and then we're going to cash in some favors later on. Like, that makes sense to them. But they're not thinking at all about any of the fans who don't like it, who feel like it's just too much. They're not thinking about any of the fans who aren't American, who are just like, why am I being forced to sit through so much American political theater when I want to watch your fights from Germany or whatever? They don't give a damn about that stuff. They also kind of don't give a damn. Can you imagine You're watching this fight and you're sitting there, you're watching these guys all lined up, and you're like, so how many sexual assault allegations is represented here in this one shot between Donald Trump, Elon Musk, RFK Jr.? Remember when RFK Jr. was asked about sexual assault allegations during his actual campaign, where somebody was like, there's allegations from a nanny who used to work for you, and he was like, hey, I never said I was perfect. And everybody went, what? That's your response to that? Imagine you're one of the UFC's many female fans. You turn that on, you watch it, and you're like, oh, okay. So that's how it is. All the fighters want to be down with these guys. All this like that's again the kind of thing that makes you feel like you're going crazy when
Yeah.
you're watching it, because you're hearing this just like all out right wing love fest for this guy, while you were going to being like, I just wanted to watch this sport, man. You guys are making it impossible for me to just relax and watch this sport. And yeah, you heard it from a lot of people, especially after this one. I heard from a lot of people unsolicited who were just like, I don't know, man, that might be it for me.
Yeah.
Like I kind of I shut up about it and soldiered through it with a lot of the other stuff, but that one felt like it was too much, and I don't know how much longer I can keep up with it.
Yeah, the New Yorker put out a story today. I don't know if you saw it. I have not had a chance to read it. I assume you have not had a chance to read it, but maybe we both can look at it and talk about it on the Patreon this week. But it says Donald Trump's UFC victory party. Dana White, the CEO of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, did as much as anyone to mobilize young male voters in favor of Donald Trump. So it's basically an article in the New Yorker about this very phenomenon. RJ Clifford, longtime MMA reporter guy, clipped out part of it and put it on his Twitter today. And I just wanted to read this to you. It says, this is just one paragraph. It says, this is the image that helped propel Trump to the presidency. The question is whether it's replicable. It's hard to imagine, for instance, young UFC fans flocking to the polls to vote for J.D. Vance in 2028. White, for his part, told me that he's done helping the presidential campaigns. Trump is a friend, but the rest of the GOP may be on its own. Now, here's the quote from Dana White. I'm never fucking doing this again, he said. I want nothing to do with this shit. It's gross. It's disgusting. I want nothing to do with politics. Now,
What?
as I tweeted, Dana White getting dangerously close to Tim Robinson in a hot dog suit territory with this quote. But like, what is to be made of this? Because Dana White, basically since the pandemic, basically since 2016, honestly, has slowly crept further and further to the right, slowly become more and more vocal in his support of this side of the political spectrum. And as we just talked about, more and more invited this influence into the UFC. What to make now? And I don't even know if he said this before or after UFC 309 that he told this to the New Yorker reporter, but like, what to make now of him coming out and saying he doesn't want to do this ever again and saying it's gross, it's disgusting. What? Dude, like you did this.
Yeah.
You singularly, individually did this. How are you going to turn around now and say it's disgusting?
I also think that, for one thing, I'm surprised that he picked up the phone when the New Yorker called and gave them a quote at all. The thing he said to me when I asked about it was, it's a respect for the office, and Trump is a friend. And if Joe Biden were to come when he's president, that I'd give him the same thing. And obviously, you would not. You would not give him this same level of adulation and attention, and neither would the fighters, just because that's not where the political leanings in this sport are. And it is like, I don't think of Dana White as somebody who was especially principled in any sort of political way. I don't like, the UFC, they gave money to Harry Reid when they thought the benefit of the. I think that it's pure self-interest. I do think that Dana White is the kind of person where it's like, if he regards you as a friend, remembering, Trump helped us out, let us feel like big time at the Taj Mahal stuff back when everybody else was looking askance at us, and I remember that, and I will reciprocate that and appreciate that. But I think mostly it is self-interest. He realizes, here is a powerful person who can do me some favors, and so I will do some stuff for them. And if it flipped, and if it were, a left-wing demagogue who was in charge, and Dana White said, like, okay, if I cozy up to this person, it will be good for us down the line, I think he'd do that too. I don't think any of it stems from any sort of like hardcore political beliefs on Dana White's part. But it is really, really over the top to an extent that they're making it impossible for anybody to ignore. And especially with Trump being such a polarizing figure. I mean, even the guy wins an election and wins the popular vote, half the country hates him. And the UFC has to be making that calculation that it's still worth it, even if, you turn off a whole bunch of people. I think a lot of people, especially in the right wing grifter space, have realized that if you need a group of people that you can easily just sort of get on your side, a lot of right wingers are those people. Because if you tell them anything, like, oh, we're mad at Bud Light now because they gave a can of beer to the wrong person, and then they'll be like, okay, we're mad at Bud Light. Oh, we like this person because they support this company. This is the anti-woke cell phone plan. Okay, let me get that cell phone plan. This just isn't any Bible. This is the Trump Bible. That's why it costs $60. Okay, let me buy the Trump Bible. Like, if you're trying to make some money off these people, that's a good crowd to play to, because they'll just sort of step right in line with all that stuff. What I wonder sometimes is about the fighters, though, man, because fighters are not known generally for being super politically interested or active. And see, John Jones, like, really, he's doing the Trump dance, he's celebrating and stuff, and I'm like, really? The guy who the Nazis like, even if you feel like, I like this guy, does it not give you pause when you're like, you know who else likes this guy? The literal Nazis in America. They love him. Do you not ever stop and think, like, I'm a little troubled to be on the same side as those guys? Or are you telling yourself, like, hey, even the Nazis got to be right about something? I don't get that. I don't know how you get there in your mind. I don't know how everything you've heard from that guy, you turn around and you be like, yeah, no. This guy, he seems like a good dude. Definitely in line with my Christian principles. Like, I don't know how anybody gets there, but I guess millions of people have.
Well, we ran way up over an hour. I don't know if we want to spend a couple minutes talking about Michael Chandler and Charles Oliveira, or if we want to save it for later in the week. We got several emails.
Yeah, I can
Basically,
sum up the emails. They say Michael Chandler cheated his ass off and still lost. That's what the
yeah,
emails
that
say.
is what they say. That is what they say. And to be honest, like, that was not necessarily my takeaway from this. I was surprised that, well, I'm not surprised, because people love to see some rule breaking in mixed martial arts.
And
But
they
my
want to
take,
tell you specifically
they do.
about it.
They want to tell me specifically about it. My takeaway was, not only was Charles Oliveira the better fighter here, but he just exploited every weakness of Michael
Yeah.
Chandler, just like totally snowballed over this guy. And as you said, resident jiu-jitsu uh, proponent here on the CME, you were getting mad that Michael Chandler was not correctly defending himself on the ground. It just seemed like he just had nothing for Charles Oliveira.
What I was thinking was, if you go out there and get out wrestled and out grappled by Charles Oliveira as a Missouri Tigers wrestling alum, do you wake up the next morning and all your singlets are gone? Somebody came in the night and took them back.
The
Because
ghost of wrestlers past come in and take your singlets.
I was surprised by that. I thought, Charles Oliveira would be the better fighter on the feet. But especially later in the fight, when Michael Chandler was finding some success and was hurting him, he was the guy who could rely on, all right, take down and control, and I'll win this fight. And he was right. That's all it took for him. Now, you're right that I think especially people have it in their minds that Michael Chandler is a dirty fighter, because Dustin Poirier basically called him one. And so then if they see any cheating at all, they'll be like, this confirms what I already believe to be the case. But he did jackhammer the hell out of the back of Charles Oliveira's head.
Yeah.
Well, we saw that. And, again, he made the often correct calculation in MMA that the referee will not do shit. He won't do shit, bro, to stop you from cheating. Face no consequences for it at all. I say, Michael Chandler, though, he manages to lose, be entertaining in losses, and then still get on the mic afterwards and almost talk like he won. Like, he's out there being like, Conor McGregor, fight me if you can, and getting a huge pop from the crowd. And we're like, this is the guy who just lost. He's like 2-4 in the UFC now. Has only beaten the guys who aren't that good. And then comes out of this, and people still love having Michael Chandler around. Like, he'll give you something. He'll give you some kind of a show,
Yeah.
and people, that's part of how this sport works.
I mean, he knows how to endear himself
He
for sure,
does.
even in a losing effort. When he was standing up in the middle of the cage at the end of the fight with Charles Oliveira on his back, and Michael Chandler is yelling "fuck it" and throwing himself backwards to slam Charles Oliveira
Yeah,
on
he
the
knows that's
mat.
not going to do anything.
No, but I was watching that on the pay-per-view and I was like, oh, right here, he's getting more fights right here.
Yeah.
Like this keeps Michael Chandler in the good graces of the UFC. It continues to make him a capital G guy in their eyes. It continues to make him marketable, and he will get more big fights, not necessarily because he has been competitive or because he deserves them, but because of this shit right here. And I firmly believe that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and that's good advice, honestly, career-wise, because if you can't win, then you should at least be fun. It would probably be better to win and be fun, but if you can't win, at least make sure people walk out of there feeling like, okay, well, I got a show, and this guy's going to give me something of entertainment value every time he's on a fight card. We've seen careers built on that in this sport.
That's going to do it this week for the Co-Main Event podcast. Thanks to everybody for listening. A reminder, we will be over on the Patreon page all week. Don't forget to take advantage of the 50% off holiday sale. Get over there to Co-Main Event or patreon.com/co-main event. Enter the code 20E as in Echo 37 at checkout to get a free month, or to get 50% off a month, or get 50% off an entire year if you feel like signing up for the annual membership. We got the live chat on Wednesday, 60 minutes of nothing but your questions, comments, and concerns. We got Thursday, Doing the Damn Thing, a show where we talk about non-MMA related content we think might be of interest to you guys. And of course, Friday's Power Hour, an entire curated hour of MMA talk to get you ready for the weekend. We'd love it if you would join us over there at patreon.com/co-main event. As for right now, thanks for listening, everybody. We appreciate the support. We are done. We are through. We are out. Let me lay an idea on you, and I can't believe that I'm about to say this out loud.
Okay.
Jake Paul versus Big Fran.
Oh, God. See, Jake Paul might be dumb, but he's not stupid.
You think Fran just murders him?
Murders him. Commits a homicide.
Well, maybe as long as Jake Paul doesn't literally die, like he might make the calculation.
He might literally die, though. It's a good chance. I think the betting sites would love it because they could offer odds on whether Jake Paul will literally lose his life.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big fight, right? Against a guy who's not necessarily an actual boxer, albeit much larger than you instead of much smaller, which is generally how Jake Paul likes to go. And, getting up there in years, but still plenty dangerous.
If Jake Paul's MVP Productions, whatever, if they put him in a fight against Big Fran, my first question would be, did somebody over there take out a life insurance policy on Jake Paul and they're trying to collect?
Did Jake Paul just change his will by chance?